trying out this new like video thing where I interview like really interesting people just to get their perspective on everything from like current politics, academics, scholarship, everything going on. This is my homie Maya. She a PhD sociology student at Cambridge University, where she's interested in the racialization of educational spaces and the impact on student identities. Her current research is on the racialized class identities of students at HBCUs in the U.S. She's really cool. She's really fire. Actually, she during her research here at Howard, she interviewed me and we like had like a really cool talk. So I just thought like her perspective, coming from the UK and coming here at Howard doing research, would just be really cool just to hear like her thoughts and her views on things. So yeah, this is my I don't know if there's anything else you want to add.
No, thank you for having
Alright,
me. I do have a little secret.
Okay.
I do pronounce it Maya, not
Oh,
Maya,
Maya.
but I never corrected you the first time.
That's crazy.
I never corrected you the first time that we met. That's also something that I think will probably come up in our conversation about like UK US differences.
Yeah.
I was named after Maya Angelou. So like
Fire.
I think my mom just loved her poetry and her writing,
Uh-huh.
and was kind of a manifestation of who I was going to become. Not saying I've become Maya Angelou in any way,
Yeah.
but just like interested in like writing and sociology and stuff like that.
That's cool.
But she like wanted to be different, so she was like, it's actually Maya.
That's fine.
But it's just like a weird UK US.
I'm
thing.
sure you grew up having to correct people like that all the time.
Yes,
Yeah.
I did, but it's not something that I'm like offended by,
Yeah.
really. But then also like it's different when it's like me and you, but whenever it's like a white person, I find it quite awkward correcting them because I
Yeah.
feel like there's so much politics around like mispronouncing a black person's name that it
Yeah.
like scares them
Yeah.
quite a lot. But yeah.
Nah, that's crazy. I ain't gonna lie. A lot of people still think my name is Timmy, like with a Timmy, and I just let it be. I ain't gonna lie.
It's like, how many black Timmys do you know? Like,
Yeah.
let's use context clues.
Yeah, but then also it's interesting because you brought up the U.S. and the UK, like the differences. I'm Nigerian, so like when I see like UK culture, I feel like if I grew up in the UK, I would be more, I guess, just like in terms of upbringing, like people just know my name's like Tammy or you know what I'm saying, Timmy Talk about all that type of stuff. But yeah,
Yeah, I was going to say it's interesting, like, because we do have quite a big, like, Nigerian diaspora, like, here in the UK. But then
Huge.
even their experiences are probably different to yours growing up in, or you know, going to school in the US.
yeah. All right, so you went to Cambridge. I'm guessing that's a lot like going to PWI. So I just kind of want to know how that experience was for you.
It was interesting. So Cambridge for me, like, I wasn't one of those kids who was dreaming of Cambridge from the age of 5 and
Yeah.
doing everything I could to get there.
Yeah.
I liked school and I worked hard, but it wasn't really for any end goal, if that makes sense. I was just kind of a swot for no reason. And then when I got to about 16, I think we had like someone come into the school. So I went to a inner city state comprehensive school, which is what you guys call public schools.
Okay.
But there weren't many people going to university, let alone Oxbridge.
Okay.
And they sort of just said, you know, you guys can apply if you want to. And it sounds so simplistic, but I genuinely didn't realize that those sorts of universities were open to like general applications. I assumed you had to go to a certain school, which looking back now is so crazy because
Yeah.
imagine if that person hadn't come in and given us that talk. Like I
Exactly.
would probably still be none the wiser. So yeah, I ended up going in 2019. I studied human, social and political sciences at Pembroke College. And I was there for 3 years, and then I stayed on to do my master's, and I'm still there now doing my PhD. So this is year 6, I think. In terms of it being a predominantly white institution, I'd say it definitely had its ups and downs. I guess to start with the downs, just it was such a culture shock. Like I grew up in Southeast London, which is hugely not even a black area, just like anything that's not white area.
Okay.
Like growing up, there was always like 2 white kids in my class. And even then they were like Polish or Albanian. Like diversity was just the norm for me. And so when I entered into my first year in 2019, I guess for anyone who's not familiar, the Cambridge system, it's split across 30 different colleges, which is kind of like
That's a
a
lot.
Hogwarts house.
That's a lot.
kind of thing. Yeah. So there's, I guess, like 2,000, 3,000 people in the year in total. But then in your college year group, so your house year group, it'll be like 200 of you, or maybe 150. I think mine was about 150. And within that amount of people, I was the only black girl.
Only one?
Yes, in my like year group.
Whoa.
Yeah, and I think there were two in the year above, and I think there was like one in the year above them. And I remember being there on the first week, and kind of always keeping an eye out to see if I could see anyone. And
it's three of y'all. Dang, that's crazy.
Yeah, it was really. It was quite a shock to the system. I remember there were 3 black boys in my year, and I instantly was like,
"Yeah,
you're my friends now, even if you don't want to be."
Exactly. So how was that like small black group at Cambridge?
It was
probably
really
like 10
tight knit.
Okay.
And I'd say that was kind of the blessing amongst it all.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'd always had like black friends growing up, but I didn't have as many like super close black friends as I did, ironically, when I got to Cambridge. I think because you're all kind of experiencing the same whiplash of what the hell is going on,
right?
And that like otherness, you just find each other so much easier. I remember that first year being in the street and just nodding at people, smiling at people, just because we were both black. And there was no other time in my life where that's ever happened to me before. But it was this like community, like looking out for each other, which was honestly really beautiful to experience.
No, that's cool. Is that what inspired your dissertation on the experience of black Cambridge students through like black hair?
Yes, it really did. You've done your research.
I did my research, yeah, I did.
Yeah, it really did inspire me. I'd always been interested in like hair and hairstyling as kind of a racializing object. Like, how does the way that we style our hair impact how people perceive us? From an academic perspective, but also just from my own experience, which is growing up with the person who has black hair. But yeah, I'd say applying that to the experiences of black students in PWIs, definitely came from my own experience there. I think the main driving factor behind why I wanted to research it was, so as I mentioned, in my first year, there was like one of me out of like 130 kids.
Yeah.
I think there were, across the 2,500, across the whole year group, there were 90 black kids.
Okay.
And that was the most they'd ever had. And I remember there was just always news reporters around and people doing stories on us, and like this celebration of like record-breaking numbers of black kids getting into Cambridge. But there was this weird feeling because we were all like, why are we celebrating? Like, this doesn't feel, if there's so many of us, like, why does it still feel like such a white space? Like, we didn't feel that victory at a personal level. And so I guess I became sociologically engaged with that question of, what does it take for a space to be white or to be black? It has to be more than just the number of black bodies or white bodies that are in that space. What other processes and like social structures are going on to make that space feel racialized in a certain way? And that's why I ended up following that intellectual pursuit.
No, that's fire. You have a quote in one of your interviews where you kind of touched on that. And you talked about the otherness, how you just mentioned at Cambridge. How do you feel like Cambridge can accommodate or can make the institution more comfortable for y'all?
This is a question.
Even if you don't have an answer, or just what do you feel like? Yeah.
No, it's cool. I just feel like this is the question that we always get, right? It's like, okay, so what can we do? Like, what's the next step?
Yeah.
In reality, there isn't like a 3-step solution to like solving racism. Like, for context, Cambridge University, so my college, Pembroke College, let's say that for example, the college I was at for undergrad, it was established in 1347.
Oh yeah. That's great, yeah.
Way older than like America as we know it.
Yeah.
Way older than like so many, like you can't even fathom
that's old. 1307, that's old, yeah.
1347. Yeah. And this year they're celebrating 40 years of letting women study there.
Wow.
So we're talking, like 1980s? 1347.
Yeah.
If it took that long for them to allow women to study and graduate, when we start talking about black people and like people of color, like, and that's how we kind of need to frame it. Like, but I think the main thing that I think will help is taking a less quantitative approach to diversity, right? So rather than focusing purely on how many black and brown kids we can get in a year, actually researching and collecting data on what their experiences are actually like. What does it qualitatively feel like to be in that space?
Right.
And if it's the case that students aren't able to be themselves, they feel ostracized, the learning model doesn't reflect, you know, an equitable model that we would like, then that's not really true diversity if people are having to fit a certain mold to take up that space.
Right.
I think that's the main thing that needs to happen. Obviously, numbers and representation, it's important, but it can't be the last step, if that makes sense.
So then what is like the state of black studies or black conversations in the academic space from like, y'all don't have K through 12, but like from like going to school when you're younger to like higher education and college, like these questions and what you're saying, what is that state like in in these institutions in London or in England, my fault?
Like in terms of like academics or like the study of black studies, or like just like how blackness is treated in the education system?
How blackness is treated in the educational system?
Oh, that's an interesting question. We have a huge issue with representation of black stories and black narratives within our national curriculum. So the national curriculum in the UK like basically sets out what each school has to cover in each subject legally. So in terms of history, we learn about the slave trade.
Okay.
Like we learn about that in, I think, year 8, so when you're like 12.
Okay.
But the way in which it is taught, and like that differs so much across schools. I remember for my year group, they just put on Roots, but I don't know if you.
Oh, the movie?
Yes.
Oh, that was it?
And a TV show, which is an incredibly graphic depiction of slavery.
Yeah, it is.
We were 12. And they just put it on, and there was no... And again, this is a class, majority black kids. Yeah. And I had a white teacher teaching us. And she just put it on, and there was no discussion really afterwards. There was no, like, oh, I wonder how this trauma, you know, might impact the kids, like, perceiving it. And so it's that kind of thing. It's not necessarily that blackness isn't taught at all. It is... The way that it is taught is completely divorced from social context. Completely divorced from, like, trauma and like the mental well-being of black children who are engaging in those studies, but also it is, at least in the UK, horrifically skewed towards just talking about slavery, as if that is when the conception of blackness started. Like there are so many, like even just talking about it as blackness feels like an understatement, because obviously there's so many different cultural histories, and like Nigerian cultural history, Ghanaian cultural history versus Caribbean cultural history, so different. But we never had anything covering that. But of course, 1066, Battle of Hastings. Yeah. I know that, you know? And it's not to say that those things aren't important, but there is so much more space to talk about other things. So yeah, in terms of how it was taught, it was very much that. And on the other side of that, if it wasn't talking about slavery, it would be Black History Month. So for us, it's in October, but for you guys, it's February. They would wheel out the same STEM slideshow. Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks. Again, very historic figures, important to recognise. Malcolm X was mentioned for reasons which are becoming clear to me now. Or if he was mentioned, it was like, he was the violent one, but Martin Luther King was the peaceful one. So let's focus on him.
Yeah, exactly.
So again, like, these very oddly apolitical ways of talking about political figures is very, like, common in our education system. But again, as if there were no civil rights activists in the UK, as if there were no black people fighting for rights here. And again, I think that's very intentional, right? This racism problem was an issue over there. We had nothing to do about it. Don't look at the Caribbean and the islands where we were doing our slavery. We had nothing to do with it. And so I just really want people to recognise that nothing is a coincidence. Like, the way our education system is set up is very intentional to, you know, shed a light on certain narratives and obscure others.
Now, it sounds very similar to the US. like really, really similar. Sound like how you're saying is very intentional. I kind of know, like, with that background, what led you to wanting to research HBCUs?
I think after I'd exhausted, well, not exhausted, but like after I'd done a lot of research on white spaces and white universities, it's kind of like we know how whiteness works at this point, right? Like we know what it means to be in a white space. We know all the insidious ways that it maintains itself. But there wasn't so much sociological understanding or at least discussion on how blackness operates as a force like that. So what does it mean for a space to be black? What does it mean for a body to fit within a black space? And so I thought HBCUs were just such an interesting example, but also thought it was interesting because once you engage with diversity studies, there always is, again, that question of, okay, so what if 99% of Cambridge was black? Like, what then? How would that change things? Would that change things? Or is the coloniality and whiteness of education something that just can't be, turned off, again, with those, like, numerical representations? So that was why I found it interesting. And also, we don't have any of those. Like, we do not have HBCUs in the UK. Again, our racial histories are slightly different. Our population of black people is slightly different in terms of, like, when those waves of migration happened.
Right.
But yeah, just so fascinating to study and experience. But equally, I think it's important to steer away from like very exoticizing narratives of like HBCUs, which you do see unfortunately a lot in sociology on them. So that's also something that I'm kind of trying to keep at the forefront of my mind. So yeah.
So you talk about a black space, right? How it was not something that's familiar in the UK. How was it when you actually did come to Howard, did come to DC, when you were in this space? How did you just feel partially? Was there any like differences or similarities, or just what ran through your head?
It was I'm so glad I did it. It was honestly life-changing sounds quite dramatic, but it did change like a lot of my perceptions of myself and the world around me. For starters, I think when people think about Howard, you can't talk about it without talking about it in its geographical context, which is within DC, right, the like political capital of the state, but also within Shore, which is like a very specific neighborhood with very particular racial histories. And so even just being there, it felt so different. It was so nice to just like sit on campus and just see groups of black kids walking around. And I think the first thing I thought was like, oh my gosh, that's not just like the black kid group.
Yeah.
That's just normal.
Yeah.
That's so crazy because back in Cambridge, that would be that. And again, even like I said earlier, like having those nods of recognition, I found myself being like, why is no one making those looks of recognition at me? And then I was like, wait, we don't have to. Like, we're the majority.
Yeah.
So that was really, really interesting.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Without giving too much on your research, because I know you did come here to do actual research topic. You mentioned what would Cambridge be like if it was 99% black. How did those questions of race, space, student experience come alive for you at Howard that maybe didn't at Cambridge?
That's a really interesting question. I think there's more space to talk about and be like honest about the diversity within blackness when you're in a predominantly black space. Because you're just fighting different battles, if that makes sense. Like when you're in a PWI, there's strength in numbers, right? So you band together, you all join the Afro-Caribbean Society. Like everyone joins that. But for example, if you're someone like me who's from the Caribbean, you're extremely outnumbered by African students.
Oh, wow.
Yes, that is one thing I would say is interesting in the UK. So if you look at sociology of education and educational statistics in terms of like exam grades, university entrance, African kids way outperform Caribbean kids. There's obviously gender nuances in that, but that is generally the pattern. And so again, you think about my 90 black kids in my year group when I first joined. Out of that 90, I remember meeting 3 other Caribbean, like kids of Caribbean heritage, and the rest, like,
were African?
Nigerian, Ghanaian. And so there was a slight feeling within spaces like the Afro-Caribbean Society that
Yeah.
it was a slight like misrepresentation, or there were things that we couldn't necessarily align on. But again, the main object in those spaces is justifying community in whatever way you find it. And looking back, I'm grateful for that. Two of my best friends are Nigerian girls, and learning more about each other's cultures was such a pivotal part of like me growing up.
Right.
But again, when you look at a space like Howard, I found there were so many more conversations on like, just those cultural differences, and a huge resistance to seeing blackness as a very homogenous thing. But like speaking to the Caribbean Students Society, for example, versus Shango, the like Spanish heritage Hispanic Student Society, to the Nigerian Society, Ghanaian Society, like everyone had their space, which isn't to the same extent in the UK, or at least in PWIs in the UK. So that was really interesting.
No, that's cool. That's really interesting that you said. I didn't know that the Africans outnumbered the Caribbeans in educational spaces in the UK. The same thing is in the US. The African and Caribbean like students outnumber like American-born African American students in higher esteemed institutions.
I had heard something about that recently.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is? Like, do you think there's something to be said there, or?
I was actually going to ask you the same thing. I think it's a whole systemic thing. When you talk about things like affirmative action, and the quota system, that like we don't really know what race is in the US. So
what do you mean by that?
So like in the US, right, the whole black, white, one drop rule thing, we don't really know what race is in any type of political or educational or even biomedical space. So like we don't necessarily see the nuances of the black vote in terms of how different ethnicities may have different aspirations with their vote, or even how like with education, right, a lot of it is a lot of K through 12, that's like grammar school, grade school. A lot of those inequalities may affect people who go to higher education, and how like a lot of Caribbean African students didn't necessarily grow up in the US like historically, so like those inequalities didn't necessarily affect them as much as other ethnic groups. So then when you look at affirmative action, where it's like you just checkboxing race, and you're like, okay, we have 20 black students, but they're all African. So it's like, do we have, you know what I'm saying? So we group black people as one thing in the box and oversimplify us instead of diversity, like you're saying.
Yeah, that is really interesting. Also, like, do you have a mixed box on forms?
Sometimes they put mix.
Because that was one thing I noticed.
Yeah.
That I was thinking a couple forms, there was like no mixed box in any sense of the word, which again is such an interesting thing when we talk about how we conceptualize race differently across that transatlantic border.
Yeah. Nah, yeah, that's true. So I was actually gonna ask you more about the interactions across that transatlantic border. Like, what role do you feel like we should have more of those things? Like, even our discussion, like me being at Howard from the States and you being in England, like just having this conversation was huge. So I just kind of want to know about your thoughts on like more future collaborations, like how you came to Cambridge to come to Howard to do research.
Yeah, and thank you first off for facilitating this conversation. I think it is really important. We know that racism as a general structure thrives on like atomization, right? Like you black people there, you black people there. If we make sure you don't speak, then you can't mobilize. Because again, we talk about being like ethnic minorities, but we are the global majority. And what would that look like if we actually were a global majority?
Right.
Like banding together, discussing things, mutual aid. Like what would that look like? It would look like a very different world order. And so again, I think it's all intentional that like we have these wars. And I know that we have like such stupid conversations on like TikTok and Twitter about, you know, black UK girl makeup versus and like all of these like weird diaspora wars, which are, okay, I hold my hands up, kind of funny sometimes, but I think we do miss the fact that there's a lot more that unites us than separates us.
Right.
but also on those things that do separate us, like on those things where we do have different experiences, like let's talk about those and like make those known. Like if we think about the idea of Pan-Africanism, it kind of sometimes gets relegated to this very historical concept of this wave of like black intellectuals that was sort of saying the same thing, right? As black people all over the world, we need to connect. I think people think about that as like a very historical concept and an idea that, I don't know, Du Bois and someone else was thinking about at some point, and then they kind of just left it alone. But actually, like, there's so much power in that, I think, and to be mobilized in a very modern sense. And I just think it's so important to have those transatlantic conversations, especially about educational spaces and like what our experiences are like within them.
No, very true. I remember I had an internship in Nigeria, and the Nigerian students were able to come to the U.S. for a little bit before we went all to Nigeria together. And they was asking me about, like, they were pointing people on the street. They're like, is this person black? Is that person black? And they would be black, but they would be, I guess, like, very racially ambiguous or white passing. And they'd be like, how is she black? And just having described that is like, damn, I really don't really have a concrete definition, because the way it's constructed in the U.S. is so different than like other places. So yeah. Before we get out of here, I do want to ask you a couple more questions. You talked a lot about the cultural differences at Howard, and at Cambridge. Was there any class difference that you saw? And do you know anything about like the hidden curriculum, about like the unspoken rules at colleges about how to navigate and how to succeed? Did you see any of that in your experience or in what other people said to you?
Absolutely. I think, well, to start with, the class system in the UK is very different to the class system in the US in terms of how race plays into it. So, for example, in the US, there's a very established like black middle class, black upper middle class, and like black elite. In the UK, we have particular black people who've done well for themselves, like in their career, very new money, but not enough that it constitutes a whole social class. So an example of that, for example, in the US, you have Jack and Jill. Institutions like that specifically made for rearing the next generation of black upper middle class kids, right? And rearing them into that hidden curriculum, into that kind of knowledge of how to get ahead. And in the UK, none of those institutions exist, again, because we don't have that class structure. And so that was really interesting to kind of navigate and have conversations with people about. And one of the reasons I was drawn to Howard as an institution, because it does have this very elite history. And by that, I mean history of producing and accepting children from very elite backgrounds. And so in terms of what blackness is understood to look like, in the UK, blackness and working class identity are very much seen as one and the same. So it was very interesting to see in the US context that that's not always the case, and that there are like very particular mobilizations and understandings and performances of blackness that take place within black middle class spaces, within like the black elite. Especially when we talk about things like the D9, like and all of these different institutions, like we don't have any of those. And so that was really interesting, just seeing how blackness is understood differently depending on those like class locations in a way that we don't really have in the UK.
Do you think that's because of just the presence of the black population in UK is more recent, more recent compared to the US? And do you feel like over time there may be that class distinction in the UK?
I think it could be, and there's certainly a growing black middle class presence within the UK, or black upper middle class presence. I would say it's kind of hard to tell. Again, so much of our history is geared towards the idea that black people just arrived here in the 50s, then that was it. But we know that people were here before then. And we know, for example, we used to have a monarchy. And we know that there were particular black individuals within that history of the monarchy who, I mean, most of them, again, found their way under Queen Victoria's reign through nefarious means, but they were there regardless. And so it is a really interesting, I think, untouched history, like the history of black elites in the UK, and one I'd love to do more research on. But yes, definitely less established than in the US. And I think that's sometimes where these kind of conversations on culture and success and what that looks like and capitalism and whether there's a way for us to benefit from said systems. I think that's why we sometimes have our wires crossed a little bit, because we do have such different experiences.
Yeah. In connection to that, you did bring up Du Bois, which made me think of the Talented 10th. And I do remember reading you wrote about the Cambridge bubble. And in that, you said, let me try to find it so I can't quote you. You said, my Cambridge degree is not a get out of jail free card. So like, I kind of want to ask you, what is there a sense of duty among students at Cambridge and students that you talk to at Howard to go back and do their for community? Or is there any like type of change of perspective after they went through the educational route?
That's a really interesting question. You really did do your research. I'm like, wow, I wrote that article like 5 years ago now. So yeah, again, it's really interesting to have this discussion because, so at least within Cambridge, the concept of the Cambridge bubble, I guess just to briefly say, is this idea that once you're in Cambridge, you kind of forget about what's going on around you. And so when you go there, everyone will say, "Oh, sorry, I didn't respond to you. I've been in the Cambridge bubble," or "Oh, that thing's going on in the world. Oh, I've just been in the Cambridge bubble."
No, that's
and
crazy.
It's always used as this kind of idiom, and I became quite frustrated with that concept because I knew that for students of marginalized identities, there was no such luxury as blocking yourself off from the outside world and pretending that you were completely in this bubble. And so in terms of reaching out of that bubble and doing community work and using your degree to do greater goods in the Black community, I think most students, I can only talk speak for myself really, but I think lots of students do feel there is a certain responsibility to give back in some way, but not in like a weird like philanthropic, like aren't you so lucky to have me giving back, more so like giving back structurally. So for example, I heard of one student who was a few years above me go back to be a school governor at her school, her primary school, which meant being on the board of people who like make decisions, and just seeing people, you know, go on to do incredible careers and trying to give back in those ways, put themselves in positions of structural power. Diana Abbott was the first Black MP, and she went to Cambridge at a time where there weren't many Black women at all. And again, so you can see over time people have definitely tried to do the work in some way. But again, the extent to which you can do that within a capitalist system whilst also profiting yourself is yet to be seen. Again, this idea that how many Black CEOs will it take for that to not be capitalist? My answer is 0. But, you know, it's still, like, it's always going to be that system, no matter who's at the top. So it's a really fine balance between, you know, a girl's got to eat, we've all got to do what we've got to do, but also recognising the bigger goal and being willing to give certain things up. So, for example, there's been a lot of debate on, like, MBEs and knighthoods being given to lots of, like, Black alumni from Cambridge, actually. In my opinion, if you are against those structures, there's no way in hell you would accept a knighthood or an MBE from the royal family. Like, you would never accept the title of being a member of the British Empire. Like, that doesn't make any sense to me. But so many people do, because it's, like, recognition of their work. So, yeah, I'm aware of time, but those conversations, I think, are really important to have. Like, at what point in your success do you actually have to give things up to stay true to those principles versus, honestly, being greedy and not really sticking to them?
No, that's true. I loved your answer. Du Bois would say that you can't, but I guess that's a different conversation for a different day. Thank you again. Yeah, thank you again for this conversation. Like I said, I loved your perspective. I just wanted other people to hear it. I thought like really unique, really interesting, and really insightful. So yeah, thank you again for this.
Thank you so much. That was really fun.
All right, cool.